Hi everybody, Dr. Todd Cameron here, way up in the woods of Idaho today. I'd like to talk a little bit more about ascorbic acid, give a little of the history. Back in the day when it was the sailors sailing in canvas-sailed boats without a lot of good food on board, scurvy was one of the leading causes of death. And scurvy is a lack of vitamin C's ability to keep the collagen together. And so these poor sailors would die horrible deaths. The blood would escape from their vessels. They'd bleed out inside their abdomens. Their bones would get soft. It was pretty grim. And in 1757, two doctors, one of them being Dr. James Lind, who was a Scottish physician working with the British Admiralty, discovered that there's something in citrus that would prevent scurvy. Actually, that's one of the reasons why, that is the reason why English sailors are called limeys, because they figured out that if they gave them limes or lime juice that wasn't boiled, that they would not get scurvy. And not only would they not get scurvy, they'd be healthy for the whole trip. So they knew that, so Dr. Lind knew that there was something, didn't know what it was, but knew that there was something in citrus that was life-saving for these sailors. So the vitamin C molecule in nature is not just ascorbic acid. Ascorbic acid, as it turns out, is kind of one part of the antioxidant coat of the whole food or whole molecule of vitamin C in nature. And of course, Dr. Lind didn't know that, and I'll get into that in a minute, who figured that out. But as I'm talking here about ascorbate, I want to make a real clear distinction between what is vitamin C as it exists in nature, in food, and what is ascorbic acid. And so imagine for a moment a picture frame. So you imagine a picture frame with a complex picture, and that can be our analogy for vitamin C. Now when you take that frame apart, there's going to be a couple of parts of that frame, say the top and bottom of the frame, that would be like a carbohydrate moiety. Moiety means chemical for part. And then the ascorbic acid would be the other aspect of it. So simply put, basically, ascorbic acid is one part of the antioxidant coat of the vitamin C molecule as it exists in nature. So it took centuries to figure out what are these active ingredients inside of the vitamin C molecule. And because we're focusing on ascorbate today, because there's a lot of other factors in there. There's there's ascorbigens, there's tyrosinase. There are many different factors inside of a whole food vitamin C. But whole food vitamin C doesn't have all of the science behind it that ascorbic acid does. So in the early 1920s, there was a Hungarian researcher by the name of Ulbert Szent-Györgyi. He was working with adrenal tissue, animal adrenal tissue, and there was something that he discovered there that he called hexuronic acid. Hex meaning carbon ring. So anyway, he discovered that there's this, quote unquote, one of the many active ingredients in the vitamin C molecule, but he didn't know it was vitamin C. He didn't know what it was, but he derived it first from adrenal tissue. Animals that make ascorbic acid in their adrenal glands, they don't die of cancer and heart disease. And what's the leading cause of death in the United States? Heart disease. He then, being Hungarian, they used a lot of paprika. And he was back in Hungary. I love this part of his life story. His wife had cooked him a meal, and in Hungary, at least at that time, you would have like not salt and pepper on the table, you'd have like salt and paprika on the table. And so he didn't really feel like paprika that particular evening. And so he was trying to figure out what to do with this paprika. And he took it to his lab, and it ended up being loaded with ascorbic acid. So within I could get this wrong, but like within 2 months, he had made like 1.5 pounds of purified ascorbic acid and started doing a lot of research on it. Well, that was hexuronic acid is what he had named it. And so he sent some to his colleagues, and everybody's doing some science on this, and they ended up calling it ascorbic acid because the term ascorbic is against scurvy. So they decided that it was the quote-unquote vitamin that was an anti-scurvy vitamin, and that's how it got its name. That's why pretty much anywhere in the world when you hear people talk about vitamin C, what they mean is ascorbic acid. But now that you know, that's only part of the vitamin C molecule. It's only part of the antioxidant coat of the vitamin C molecule. It happens to be a super potent part of the vitamin C molecule that we can utilize to our benefit. For example, in my clinic, those of you that know me, we do a lot of IV vitamin C. And, we support people with cancer, we treat colds and flus, and during this time of the coronavirus, even though we're not presently seeing patients in the clinic, certainly we're coaching them, as I'm going to do today, on how to, what types are available and how do you use it orally. Succinctly put, since Ulbert sent Gorgi derived ascorbic acid from adrenal glands and then paprika, there's been over, and last time I checked, it was, a month ago, but there's over 2,300,000 studies on ascorbate. And the interesting thing about these studies is some of the studies say it doesn't seem to be very effective, and other studies say, no, on the contrary, it's incredibly effective. It's effective against pathogens and toxins and venoms and poisons and all kinds of things. The likes of Pauling and Linus Pauling, Ewan Cameron, and Frederick Klenner, 3 of my great heroes when it comes to ascorbate. Frederick Klenner was actually curing polio, and this has been proven by injecting ascorbic acid into the muscle of people back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And it's like, well, why don't we hear more about how incredible this quote-unquote injectable ascorbate is to cure pathogens like polio? Well, when you look at the politics of medicine, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. It's not a drug, it's a nutrient, or it's part of an existing nutrient. It's a derived aspect of vitamin C. It just happens to be super powerful. But Dr. Klenner, to my knowledge, it was only during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I'm pretty sure he only got written up in maybe a small handful. I remember 2, to be exact, peer-reviewed journals where his work was presented, because peer-reviewed journals weren't really that interested in a nutrient. They were more interested in, hey, we need to create a drug that we can make profitable and etc. You know how that goes. Well, fast forward a little bit, and there's a physician, a cardiologist by the name of Dr. Thomas Levy. He has a very interesting history himself. He's a very strong proponent of the use of ascorbic acid in all forms, especially the liposomal form, which I will discuss in just a moment. But he has written a number of books, all very well cited, so scientifically pretty darn solid. He's written Curing the Incurable. He's written Primal Panacea, Stopping America's #1 Killer. One of my books that walked out of my clinic several years ago and has never returned. So if any of you guys are watching this, have my book, bring it back, will you? It's called Death by Calcium. It has nothing. It's not talking about ascorbic acid necessarily. But in any case, when people are sitting in my clinic, coming in, say for an IV, they got a cold, they got pneumonia, or they're suffering from cancer, and we're doing, complementary treatments with them, etc. I have these books that I've just mentioned, and I want them on the tables available to my patients so they can reach down, pick one up, And even the most skeptical person, all I really ask them to do, I say, of course I don't want you to read this book while you're sitting here getting your drip. But I would love it if you just looked through the table of contents. And usually what happens is it blows their mind. Because if they hadn't heard about it before, of course it doesn't blow the mind of people that are already aware of it. They're just like, well, duh. I was reading, Linus Pauling when I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Okay. But it is rather interesting that this is now in the day of COVID-19, like even in Wuhan, China, and in a few places in America, they're using IV vitamin C, and they're calling it high dose. And this is kind of cosmically hilarious to me, because they're calling a high dose much higher than the recommended daily allowance. Well, I don't know what you guys know about the recommended daily allowance for nutrients, but I'm underwhelmed with the numbers, to say the least. So 1,500 milligrams of IV vitamin C, to me, is a drop in the bucket. It's not even close to something that's efficacious if you're sick, like real sick. There's all these studies. As I had mentioned, there's well over 2 million studies. And the question that two researchers from the UK, Hickey and Roberts, asked a number of years ago is they asked, hey, why is this stuff still so controversial if there's so much science on it? So they decided to do a meta-analysis of the existing science in the literature. A meta-analysis, for those of you that don't know what that is, it's a study of studies. And so you go back, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever years, and what these researchers did is they decided to take so many studies from the point of view of it's not very efficacious, and then so many studies from the point of view or the data that suggests no, in fact, it's quite efficacious. And so, of course, if they were to spend their time looking at 2,500 studies or 2,500,000 studies, they'd be, pushing up daisies before they got through with their meta-analysis. So they took a handful on each side of the fence. It does good, it doesn't do good. And the other kind of cosmically hilarious thing to me is the only difference in the studies is frequency and amount. Frequency and amount. The studies that showed that it didn't really do anything, not enough, too infrequently. The studies that show it definitively works, more frequently. That's what it boils down to. It's as simple as that when it comes to ascorbic acid. Different story when it comes to vitamin C in nature, but if we're using ascorbic acid, so what are we actually doing when we use ascorbic acid? So what does the science actually say in terms of what is it actually doing? Well, we know a lot about ascorbic acid, how it helps to knit, collagen, and how like I had previously mentioned, animals that make ascorbic acid, they don't die of cancer and heart disease. But what it's really doing, and this is how I tell it to my patients, is I say, look, it's quite clear that it increases the utilization of the macronutrients and very likely the micronutrients. So for sure we understand that carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are better utilized. But when you're going up against a pathogen like a virus, for example, or you're going up against a poison or a toxin or radiation or venom, you need to meet the amount of damage to the cells with the amount of frequency and amount of the ascorbate. So one simple analogy is this. Imagine whatever the illness is, whatever the sick cell is, could be coming from viruses, could be coming from toxins, whatever it is. Imagine that is a fire. And what we want to do is we want to put the fire out. Well, how does one actually put the fire out? Well, you need water. Where do you get the water? Well, the water's in the river. Okay, how do we get the water from the river to the fire? You need a bucket. Ascorbic acid is a bucket. There's a lot of buckets out there, glutathione, alpha lipoic acid. Anyway, in terms of ascorbate, is you have a bucket, you go over to the river, you get the water, and you come and you put the water on the fire. The question then becomes is how big is the fire? How consistent is the fire? How long has the fire been burning? How much water do we actually need? Do we need a bucket full? Well, remember that humans don't make ascorbate, so my guess is no. We need a bucket brigade. And so what I'm going to help you guys understand today is why it's so important to continue dosing yourself with ascorbate through times of viruses or bacteria or what have you. So what is actually happening is cells that are sick are actually electron deficient. And a substance like ascorbate, like I said, there's others, will donate electrons. And that means that they will reduce the damage in the cell. So that the terms oxidation reduction come into play here. I don't want to go off on that, but it's an oxidized cell or oxidized molecules within a cell. That is what's making the cell sick. It's one of the reasons why when we eat food, we want to eat our way through colors. Colors have tons of antioxidants. Vegetables, for example. We have greens, we have yellows, we have orange, we have red, we have purple and blue, and just all of those colors have a different components and amounts of antioxidants, and they all donate electrons to our cells, to the molecules within our cells, and help the cells stay healthy. And so at the end of the day, you need to deliver electrons to sick cells. And the more electrons that you can deliver over time, the more able that cell is to not only protect itself, but to regenerate what it needs to regenerate and to become healthy again. And this is just as true in a muscle cell as it is an immune cell. So this is how I like to think, or this is how I teach my patients to utilize commercially available ascorbic acid. So what types of ascorbic acid are available commercially to us, just off the shelf? And I can tell you right now, there's less, because during the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are starting to figure out that that ascorbic acid is very effective. All kinds of ascorbic acid is disappearing from shelves. So, as previously mentioned, there's whole food ascorbic acid, acai, berry, rose hips, paprika. There's a lot of places in nature where whole food vitamin C occurs. And I won't go off on that, because you can do a Google search and you can get all manner of fruits and vegetables that have concentrated amounts of ascorbate in them, and I recommend people consume those on a regular basis. But in terms of the derivations, there is plain old ordinary run-of-the-mill ascorbic acid that you can buy either in bulk or in capsules. There's liposomal vitamin C, and a good place to learn about the liposomal. Liposome just means that the ascorbic acid molecule has been encapsulated into the most common is phosphatidylcholine, which is the leading phospholipid of the cell walls, our plasma, what we call plasma membrane. And Tom Levy does a great job on YouTube. If you just go to YouTube and type in Tom Levy, Levy, Dr. Tom Levy, and then a lot of videos on vitamin C will come up. Most of them are on liposomal vitamin C. You can even learn on YouTube how to make your own liposomal vitamin C. It's not quite as well absorbed, But if liposomal vitamin C, if it's a true liposome, some of the products out there are true liposomes, meaning a very, 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 very small product, or small micelle, little ascorbic acid wrapped with phosphatidylcholine. Others are emulsions. They're a little bit bigger, but they're still more absorbable intracellularly than just regular ascorbate, for example. But any of this stuff will be effective if you take enough of it and you do it as frequently, and I'll go into that in a moment. So there's food-based, there's ascorbic acid powder, there's buffered ascorbic acid, buffered so it's not so acidic in the stomach or in the body, and usually their ascorbate is buffered by using alkaline minerals such as calcium, magnesium, and or potassium. The problem with utilizing this up to bowel tolerance, which I'll talk about in a minute, is once you reach bowel tolerance, you're left wondering, is it the ascorbic acid that's making me have diarrhea or loose stool, or is it the magnesium that's in there? So that's an issue with the buffered version if you're trying to titrate your dose up to bowel tolerance, which is what you would do is if you were, direly ill and all you had was ascorbate. There is ascorbyl palmitate, which is a fat-soluble version of ascorbic acid. I think that's about it. I mean, I'm sure there's some other forms out there, but so Dr. Robert Cathcart is another one of my heroes. He passed away before liposomal technology came along. He would have loved liposomal technology. It is absolutely incredible. It is the most effective and efficient way to get ascorbic acid molecules intracellularly. Even better than IV vitamin C. The only reason why IV vitamin C is superior is concentration. Because if you're bypassing the gut, you can go right into the vein. You can get that concentration up super high, super fast. And that, it can be extremely helpful for all manner of pathologies and cancer and whatnot. So I want to talk a little bit through because in this day and age, all the liposomal seems to be being bought up, and if you're lucky enough to be able to go online and buy just 99.9% ascorbic acid powder, which we still have, by the way, at the clinic, last time I checked, in half-pound sacks. 1/4 of a teaspoon of ascorbic acid is 1,125 milligrams. And somebody who is doing a maintenance dose of ascorbic acid is going to want to do, and I'm just generalizing here, but I'm just saying 1/4 teaspoon about every 3 to 4 hours during a waking period. The reason for that is the following. How long vitamin C stays in the body, and once you take it and it's absorbed into the blood, it has about a 30-minute in blood time, and then it gets into the tissues, into the cells, and in about 4 hours that will be used up. It's hydroscorbate at that point in time. You urinate it out. It gets back in the blood, goes to the kidneys, and you pee it out. That's one of the reasons why you need to dose on a regular basis. So in general, what I'm saying to people, if you're treating yourself for an illness that you're feeling, like if you're coming down with a cold, flu, COVID-19, dry cough, fever, listen, 1/4 teaspoon every hour is not too much. But if you're just maintaining and you're well, then a quarter teaspoon every 3 to 4 hours is adequate. The liposomal, liposomal does better taken on an empty stomach. You can't really build up to bowel tolerance with liposomal because, after it gets down, I don't know how far into the intestine, not very darn far, you've absorbed all that into it's gonna be getting into your cells real fast. When you're buffering it, like let's say you start taking your capsules of ascorbate or your ascorbic acid powder, and it's really bothering your stomach, it hurts, then I would recommend that you buffer it. And you can either buy buffered, it's more expensive, or Arm & Hammer baking soda can be used. So if any of you have ever remember making a volcano for your kids, you put some baking soda into a little cup in there. They've modeled their mountain, and you got a little cup in there, and you've got the baking soda in there, and then all you do is pour a little vinegar down, and then it effervesces and it comes up, and if you put a little red dye in there, it looks like lava bubbles coming out. Well, the same thing is going to happen when you buffer your own vitamin C. And so what you want to do is you want to get a container that's larger than the amount of water that you have in it. So, let's say you take a half a quart of water in a 1 quart container, and you put in, say, a heaping teaspoon of ascorbate. That's 5,000 milligrams. A measured teaspoon, when you measure it off or flatten it off, that's 4,500 milligrams. Okay, but you don't want to drink that because it tastes sour like crazy, and because acidic things taste really sour. You ever bite into a lemon? So then you start putting in like maybe quarter teaspoons of Arm & Hammer baking soda and then stirring it. It will effervesce. It'll bubble up. And so that's why you've used a container that's larger than the amount of fluid that you have in there, so it won't bubble up over the top and make a big old mess. So you then keep doing that and stirring it until it stops bubbling, and then you put in a little bit more and a little bit more until you get to the place where it's not bubbling anymore. And you taste it, and it'll be not sour anymore. It is now buffered. You've taken the acidity to a neutral place, and that's going to be a lot easier on your gastrointestinal tract. The problem with that, if you're treating somebody who is ill, let's say you have an elderly family member that has COVID, and you want to treat them in this way. So the problem with buffering the ascorbic acid is that you're going to titrate your dose up to bowel tolerance, and that's the Robert Cathcart, dosing so much vitamin C every, let's just say, for example, you start taking that quarter teaspoon of buffer, or like a quarter cup or whatever of the buffered vitamin C fluid that you have, and you're doing that, every third or fourth hour. Well, if you don't get by the end of the day, if you don't have loose stools, you have not buffered up to bowel tolerance. But using the buffered fluid, or buffered capsules that you purchased pre-buffered, the problem is if you're working up to bowel tolerance with just ascorbate that's been buffered, is when you get to bowel tolerance, you have a pretty serious question to answer. Have I reached bowel tolerance because of the amount of ascorbate that I'm taking in? Or is it because the amount of sodium bicarb or calcium or magnesium or potassium that's in there? Is that making that worse? So at that point in time, what I tell people to do is keep dosing up if you can put up with the loose stool, because part of your bowel tolerance is the actual substance that you used to cut the acidity and buffer it versus the ascorbate itself. So, summary of how to take it: liposomal, whatever type you can get your hands on, or if you've made, you can do it a number of times through the day, say 2-3 times a day. I would also be taking other forms of ascorbate in between those times while you're well. But if you become ill, you need to keep the dose going up. And just think about the analogy of the fire and the water. In order to put the fire out, you've got to get enough water to it. And so you just got to keep delivering the water until the fire goes out. Of note, you might, in references, and maybe when we finish up this video with, with my editors and stuff, I'll throw in some imaging and some references, but right now I'll just mention, Tom Levy. Go to YouTube, Dr. Tom Levy, liposomal vitamin C. They'll come up just with his name. Ascorbic acid powder can be purchased online. You can dose yourself per my dose instructions, and you can make your own liposomal, like I had mentioned before. What you need to make your own liposomal is you need a blender, ascorbic acid, lecithin, and a ultrasonic jewelry cleaner, which you can buy on the internet for around $30.